welcome on behalf of the Vienna School of International Studies for today's panel event. We are discussing today the future of diplomacy after COVID-19, multilateralism and the global pandemic. And this is about to promote actually a very good initiative coming from practitioners of the world of multilateralism who decided not just to spend the lockdowns at home or looking for new ways of communicating, but also to write down how they see the possibilities, challenges, and chances of multilateralism after the COVID-19 crisis. So a lot of us speaking on international affairs are already tired of talking about what will be the consequences of COVID-19. But actually, we are at the moment in the chance of doing something about it. So I think it is a very special moment when practitioners from the UN system, speaking on their own personal capacity, took the time to think about during the last year, what will be the consequences, what was the situation before, and how can we make best use of it. Among political leaders, there is a lot of people speaking about effective multilateralism, but nobody so far could really explain in the political world what they mean by effective multilateralism without maybe saying they want to have a change. And I'm very happy to say, and I guess I'm not saying too much, that today's speakers all come from a rather optimistic angle and perspective to multilateralism. I have to say, when we discuss at the Vienna School of International Studies this issue, our students normally start at the beginning to be very optimistic, but at the end of our 2 years, some of them are rather more realpolitisch, so are rather more realistic about the chances that we have. And my own experience as a diplomat has always been that the secretariats, the diplomats, the ground workers are always much more open and radical to change of the multilateral system than the political leaders. So I guess the aim of this undertaking, this discussion, but also the book, is really to say that political will is needed for a change that has been discussed for decades, changing the UN system, which more or less is the system of the years 1945 and following. So I'm looking forward to listen to what you all have to say about whether it's true that this COVID-19 crisis is not only a fire accelerator, which it certainly is to a certain extent, but also maybe a game changer. I hope that you are right, that there is a chance for a change of the game that we are all in. We deserve to have something like this, but we know that the constraints and the space for change, especially if you have to put together almost 200 national governments on the one hand, is very difficult. Sometimes I'm reminded of Gulliver's Travels, when Gulliver awoke in the Lilliput's land, and he was tied down to the ground with all these strings attached to him. And I have the feeling most of our countries are not so big Gullivers, so that the strings are very strong that are attached to them. But some of the Gullivers are quite big, and they are making better use of the system that they experience than the other ones. But this is already maybe too much of a critical observation on the present day situation. I'm much hoping that we can make a contribution to the change necessary towards a more effective multilateralism. This is a book which will be published by Routledge, and Routledge is certainly a good partner in all of this. And having said all this, I wish us an interesting discussion, and I pass on to our professor of international affairs, Professor Markus Kornprobst, who will moderate this panel discussion.
Emil, thank you very much for your introductory remarks. I'm going to quickly introduce now our presenters of today. And then we're going to move to the actual panelists who are going to present for about 5 minutes each. And after, we're going to have questions and answers. For those of you who have not tuned in here on this channel with us before, So you have the opportunity to ask questions and via Facebook, and they're going to appear then here when we operate with Zoom on a chat function. I can read then these questions to the audience. Always works very well. And it's obviously also in the interest of the presenters to get good feedback from you. We're very happy about a great number of wonderful practitioners who know a lot about multilateralism, multilateralism in general, and the United Nations in particular. Let me briefly introduce them to you in the order in which they're actually going to talk. The first one is Hana Al-Hashimi. She's an Emirati member of the United Nations Secretary General's Internet Governance Forum Multi-Stakeholder Advisory Group, and a former senior advisor in the Office of the President of the General Assembly. Hana, welcome. Then our next presenter will be Wat Mulakhela, is an Indonesian diplomat who served as senior advisor on partnerships to the 73rd and the 74th presidents of the General Assembly. Cordial welcome to you as well.
Thank you.
Our third speaker will be Tony Shay. She's a senior advisor in the Office of the President of the United Nations General Assembly and director of the Population and Health Unit Planning Institute of Jamaica. Tony Shay, welcome. Then we have Jonathan Vieira. He is an Ecuadorian diplomat who has served as negotiator in the key economics and sustainable development processes of the United Nations. And he's also taught at universities in Ecuador and in the United States. Welcome, Jonathan. Andres Fiallo is an Ecuadorian diplomat who has contributed to central processes within the United Nations as a negotiator, coordinator, and senior advisor on international law, human rights, social affairs, peace, and security. Welcome, Andres. And then last but not least, Mona Ali Khalil is the director of MAC Law, which is an affiliate of the Harvard Law School program in international law and armed conflict. And she's a former senior legal officer of the United Nations. Welcome to you as well. So then, without losing any time, we're gonna go now to the presentations. And Hannah's is going to take a little longer. She's going to tell you not only about her chapter in the book, but also about the book project as such. And so it's going to last for about 7 to 10 minutes, and the rest for about 5 minutes. In the interest of getting the discussion going then afterwards, I will remind presenters if they go over time. Okay, I'll do so gently, I promise. Hannah, you have the word.
Thank you so very much, Professor Kornfrost, and thank you, Ambassador Brix, for the warm welcome. Einen wunderschönen guten Tag to everyone listening. Sincere thanks to the Vienna School of International Studies for the invitation to present our book today. It's a true privilege to join you. I hope that your families are safe and in good health in these times, and that we get the chance to meet in person soon. Vienna, of course, holds a dear place to my heart as a former expert in UNIDO, and I would lose no chance to come back anytime. But in the meantime, we do value the chance that's afforded by the current circumstances to be joined by guests from all over the world in the same event. And so I'd like to thank you all for being here. And it's exactly that virtual cross-border connection that brought us, the authors of this book, together. As the professor has mentioned, we each hail from different countries with different backgrounds. However, we were able to come together at this time in order to think about sort of what the lessons can be teased out of the current situation and how this might be useful to practitioners and to the field itself of diplomacy and of multilateralism. So what we have in common is that all of us have experience in having advised presidents of the General Assembly and member states on multilateral processes, and all of us share a deep deep belief in the potential of international cooperation and multilateralism to solve global challenges. All of us are also writing and speaking in our personal capacities, and so don't hold this against us today. What was not mentioned beyond my dear colleagues that you will hear from on the call today is that we were also joined by experts in their respective fields with contributions. And I will outline them perhaps later on in the opening remarks, but we will also be sharing the key messages from their contributions to the book project that we believe add a lot of value. But really, what we're talking about today, the future of diplomacy after COVID-19, this really started as just an idea in April 2019 about how we can perhaps share our experiences from working within the United Nations General Assembly, within what's called the Parliament of Humanity, with the world, with a view to strengthening that important role that it plays normatively, and to make sure that it's able to fulfill its own goals and objectives. In April 2019, so this was a time when, on the one hand, you had some actors having quite strong criticism of multilateralism itself, on whether it's effective, on whether it's helpful, which we think was an important discussion to have. And on the other hand, you had a strong defense almost of the system from a lot of countries. In the year that many of us served together in the office of the President of the General Assembly, there was a record number of heads of state and government that were there at the United Nations, and this is September 2018, to defend really and uphold the multilateral system and rules-based international order. And we thought that presence was not just out of interest to a travel to New York. It was a lot deeper than that, in that it's a belief that particularly for smaller states, that this is a system that many of us rely on and depend on to be able to reach our own development goals, and that there is something to be said of the power of international cooperation. In April 2020, though, this turned into a WhatsApp group. And these days, not much can be done without a WhatsApp group. But having said that, we've come from that WhatsApp group to the book being published, inshallah, as we say in the UAE, God willing, on the 11th of May. And we're very, very privileged to be able to preview it with you today. So we had 4 objectives coming together. Number 1 was to provide a practitioner's guide to what was, what currently is, and what could be the new diplomacy as we see it. We bring you the perspective of negotiators, of people that have worked on the design and compromise around global agendas, and bringing in our practical experience, whether it's glamorous or not, into the process. All of us have worked directly in international public policy and the establishment of global agendas, most notably the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and the Addis Ababa Action Agenda on Financing for Development, as well as the Paris Climate Agreement. The second objective is to provide a highly timely consideration of lessons that can be taken in the middle of this crisis as it developed. And importantly, from a developing country perspective. So all of us are from relatively small states and from developing countries. And we note that there isn't always a lot that one hears from our respective nations. And we wanted to add, hopefully, to that insight that we have to bring. So what we've done collectively is aim to lay out principles that would be necessary for the future of global cooperation in each of our thematic strands. So it includes overall multilateralism, sustainable development, economics, digital governance, and peace and security, as well as the rule of law. The third objective is to provide a practical perspective of what would be needed in each of these sectors to be able to survive into the future. And as we plan for the midterm review of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development in 2022, as well as for the next 25 years of the United Nations towards its 100th anniversary in 2045. We think that dates can have an important role to play in centering around agendas and agreeing on priorities moving forward. And we've seen that firsthand. So we wanted to use that opportunity, having written in the 75th year of the United Nations, where for all perhaps external purposes it looked like the work could not continue as people could not meet in that Parliament of Humanity physically, but to see how what kind of mechanisms were teased out of that, what lessons can be learned, and how that can be applied to the future of the organization and multilateralism overall. And the fourth objective, and the final objective really, was to provide a fresh perspective on international relations, and particularly multilateralism, based on lessons learned from the pandemic and its disruption of international affairs. So to give you an overview, perhaps, of how the book starts and the context in which we've written, the pandemic, of course, hit, as mentioned briefly earlier, in what some would call a crisis of multilateralism. And as it did in most sectors, whether diplomacy or economy, education, or any sector really, employment certainly, it was a great amplifier of existing trends. So while there was the greatest need for global cooperation in order to mitigate the spread of the virus, and of course the deployment now of vaccines, some would argue that it wasn't as fast as it could have been. There was a lack of political leadership, and the many were really disappointed. And the repercussions, of course, ran deep. Of course, this affected people's lives. It affected, tragic loss of life. It overwhelmed healthcare systems. In many places, it continues to do so. And the socioeconomic recovery, we're only starting to understand how deep it's going to run and how much of a challenge it will be to overcome. Well, what we try to do in the book is to consider more detail on these challenges, on the opportunities that they might provide, and on future prospects for the system overall. So the timeline that we're looking at really is basically January to October 2020. January, because that's when the World Health Organization first submitted their advisory of the global pandemic in January 2020. And then October, because that was actually the point at which we commemorated the 75th anniversary of the United Nations on UN Day on the 24th of October. And we thought that significant because just as world leaders, came together virtually in this instance in that Parliament of Humanity, that representative body of the 7+ billion people in the world, and they set the agenda towards the 100th anniversary of the UN without physically being together. We thought that was indicative of kind of the new normal and whether and how we would be able to work together as the global community. I think it's also important to point out that each chapter focuses on a similar structure, and that's what brings us together in spite of the different topics of overall impacts of COVID, development, economics, and financing, digital governance, peace and security, and rule of law. What they do is they introduce readers to the current situation in their respective area by the end of 2019 or the start of 2020. So it provides basically a status quo, first off, followed by a constructive consideration of the impact of COVID on that field, and then going into potential lessons learned and key recommendations moving forward for that field to be able to deliver for the people of the world. So in other words, what they go into is the parameters that are needed for resilience in that sector for the future. This future orientation, we think, is particularly important because the book is coming out at a time as countries are starting and all sectors are starting to facilitate the whole process of building back better in COVID response plans, while also creating space for a focus on global commitments around sustainable development and the future of the UN. So the book hopefully will provide actionable policy recommendations in each of these domains. My colleagues will go through their respective chapters. However, I wanted to start off with an overview, at least of also the introduction, as well as my own chapter on digital cooperation. So starting with the introduction, we really see COVID-19 as the point where public health and diplomacy converge in a way. So we provide kind of a high-level overview of the pandemic and its disruption of the diplomatic system, both at the global level, at the national level, and the individual level, the impact of delaying multilateral processes, as well as moving receptions, which, the events that people think is all we do as diplomats sometimes online, and somehow convincing people to attend these events without providing free food, which is a challenge to the best diplomats. The introduction also explains the structure that follows and discusses, the extent to which wide-ranging effects of the pandemic either absorbed or reinforced socio-political and economic decisions made in capitals, and inversely how the interplay in domestic and international circumstances informed the formulation of diplomatic priorities and goals. We're also very privileged to include a special article by the President of the 74th session of the General Assembly, His Excellency Tijani Mohammed Bande, who provides a historical account really that goes through the 75 years of the UN and the rules-based international system, introducing the three pillars, of course, peace and security, sustainable development, human rights, as mutually reinforcing and supportive. And then going through some of the major achievements of the organization, including the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the ending of discrimination in all forms, at least as a normative agreement among all countries, adopting a framework for sustainable development that's truly global and that recognizes that there is no development without all countries coming on board, and that a simple issue can affect countries all over the world, and that, of course, is typified by the pandemic. And then giving the significance of these landmark agreements in the 74th session. Of course, at the time when we marked UN Day on the 24th of October 2020, we also marked having 42 million cases of COVID around the world, over 1 million deaths, millions of jobs lost, and 1.6 billion children's education having been disrupted, with, of course, disproportionate impacts on the vulnerable. So what we did see hope in, though, was that we already had a roadmap. And this is something that Tony Shay and other colleagues will also elaborate on, certainly in their segments. And that is the Sustainable Development Goals, the Paris Climate Agreement, and the other architectures that we're very honored to have participated in creating in our time at the United Nations over the last few years. Essentially, what we go through is three main points, just to summarize. The first is that what digital technologies have done and what they have in common with the COVID pandemic is that they've catalyzed both positive and negative trends, and have demonstrated that multilateralism is essential in order to amplify that positive aspect. The second is that whenever we're looking to the future, and even especially in the digital space, that the human element is perhaps the most important. And so the essential part is for everyone to be able to collaborate to ensure that technology makes sure that nobody is left behind. And we must, of course, keep in mind that any consideration of governance in the digital space must include voices from all over the world, particularly developing countries, in that dialogue. And finally, what we see in the consideration of digital cooperation is akin to the consideration of the new multilateralism. And that new multilateralism depends on a multi-stakeholder approach. The world is very different from the Westphalian state order that was seen in 1945 with the creation of the United Nations. And now non-state actors working hand in hand with diplomats on matters of governance has become an effective way forward, both online and offline, in our increasingly interdependent world. So I'll stop there, but very much look forward to the discussion moving forward. Thank you.
Hana, thank you very much. And our next speaker is Bart, please.
Okay, thank you so much, Ambassador Brix, and also Professor, for the opening remarks and the introduction. I will follow up to what Hana already mentioned earlier, especially that the time frame of this book that we wrote is from January to October last year. What became perhaps the starting point is that earlier last year, the Secretary General of the UN, when he made a call to take the moment of UN 75th anniversary as an opportunity to improve the way the UN work, to do things differently. In January, the Secretary General did not envisage that what he said would mean so different, in the meaning that right now the UN works very differently, but not necessarily because of the 75th anniversary, but because of the pandemic, because of how the COVID-19, that is a lot more than just a health crisis, has affected the way diplomacy is taking place, especially here. So I would look at it this way. When we discuss about in this book, in my chapter, the impact of COVID-19 in diplomacy can be seen at least in three levels, as Hana already hinted earlier. First is in the global level. It means that the discussion in the UN, the substantive conversation in all the meetings since COVID-19 became pandemic is changed. So almost in every conversation, in every team, if we look in all, for example, in peace and security, in women protection, in the rights of children, everything is now, it has another element, how COVID impacts this diplomacy in that field. And that's in the global level, that's something that's changing. And then also, my other colleagues will speak more on their respective fields about how COVID-19 affects the specific topics. But apart from the global level, we can also see the impact of COVID to the national level, in terms that the national priorities of all countries are changing because of the demand, and also that not all countries have the same effect, not impact by the pandemic, but we can see there is a pattern. How, for example, in the beginning, in the earlier phase of the pandemic, the priority of many countries were how to protect how to provide access to emergency facilities to save lives, to implement lockdown, also to prevent from the economic impact of all these measures. And then we also see how the priorities of some countries in repatriating their overseas migrant workers, because the travel were closed, borders were closed, between countries were closed. So we can see that there is a new things that become priorities for government, how they allocate budget, how they shift budget from infrastructure, for example, to mitigate the impact of the COVID-19. Also, for us, for diplomats, because I'm speaking here mostly based on experience, we see that the rotation of diplomatic staff is being postponed, canceled. All meetings are postponed, travels are canceled. So there is also effect in the national level. And then lastly, in the individual level, as diplomats, the way we conduct business with since we were not able to have in-person meetings due to the restrictions, we have to be creative. We have to be using other tools to have these virtual meetings, like I already mentioned as well. But all these things, these three levels, when we look how the UN operates, it's also important to understand that as an organization, the UN needs to be able to make decisions, because this is perhaps an element that you will see more in detail in the book, based on the experience from the 74th session of the GA that navigate the procedural aspects, the nitty-gritty of how we try to ensure that decisions can be made even though we cannot meet in person. So flexibility were shown there, but also I think when Ambassador Brix mentioned about the Gulliver's Tale, the nitty-gritty, how really it's broke down by procedural aspect, how to continue. I think that really reflects how last session of the GA experienced that challenge, how we can continue the UN to take decision, because we could not have in-person meetings, especially from April to July or August, except for some meetings in June, which were for elections purpose for the Security Council, non-permanent members, for the President of the General Assembly, as well as for the ECOSOC members. I think one more thing that I want to add in terms of the chapter that I contributed is on how the UN historically has been able to evolve since its creation in 1945. In fact, before COVID-19 happened, the Secretary General already proposed the UN reform. But of course, that's different. When we have COVID, whatever that has been discussed before is needs to be redefined, needs to be contextualized again. Perhaps I don't want to go too much details to give time to other speakers, but I'm happy to elaborate further during Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you very much. You were perfectly in terms of timing. That's great. Then our next speaker is Tony Shay, please.
Thank you, Professor, and Ambassador, for your kind introduction. And of course, it's a pleasure to be here with my dear colleagues. I keep saying that this was a labor of love. But of course, a pleasure to share on the particular perspectives in the chapter on the future of sustainable development, where I started by just giving an overall assessment of the impact of COVID-19 on the sustainable development landscape and its implications in the short, medium, and long term. And recognizing that 2020, the point at which we were at a crossroads, because we were launching the decade of action for delivery on sustainable development, and then came COVID. So it gives a snapshot of the progress at the end of the first 4 years of implementation of the 2030 agenda, which really was marked with very great fanfare and optimism in 2015. Over that period, we show how the 140 thereabouts countries who have presented their voluntary national reviews, how they have demonstrated kind of a mixed picture of progress, showing that progress had been very slow on several SDGs, and that the action on sustainable development was insufficient to protect the most vulnerable people and countries. But what has been probably a hallmark of the 2030 agenda so far has been, the considerable efforts of various stakeholders to rally efforts to achieving this very comprehensive and far-reaching agenda, We've seen, and Nabil has raised some of this, how countries have integrated SDGs into their national planning, reporting, and financing, which is a critical component. How the UN system itself has undertaken its deepest reform to be able to support the delivery of the Sustainable Development Goals. And Hana spoke to, this whole of society approach, where we've seen where a wide range of stakeholders, particularly youth, who have spurred action and introduced entry points to advance progress on the goals. So, the chapter focuses us on the social and economic consequences of the pandemic, and the regional as well as the urban-rural dynamic, and how it affects people, health, well-being, and threatening human rights in general. And by June 2020, just about at the midpoint of last year in our writing, the implications really painted a very grim and gloomy picture. We know that it triggered this global health emergency, but it pushed over 71 million people back into poverty. Several countries plunged into economic recession, and some countries are now experiencing debt distress. My colleague Jonathan will touch on some of that when he speaks to his chapter, and how it disproportionately affected, the most vulnerable people: women, children, older persons, persons with disabilities, migrants, and refugees. And for those countries, the least developed countries, landlocked developed countries, and small island developing states, from which I'm from one of them, they were particularly vulnerable to these external shocks, to their already fragile, macroeconomic landscape. So the response to the multidimensional impact of COVID really is a true test of the 2030 agenda and the wider sustainable development framework. And it magnifies, unfortunately, the global ill-preparedness of external shocks, irrespective of, their genesis. So this decade of action that we heralded and launched in 2020 is now essentially a decade of recovery, because some of these very vulnerable countries, it's projected that many of them, it will take 4 to 5 years for them to get back to their post-COVID status, and many of them were already lagging behind. So you can already identify the kind of challenges that these countries, will be facing. As you can well appreciate, this provides countries with a perfect opportunity to reset their priorities and to tackle what are some of their most pressing issues. And in this chapter, as you know, sustainable development is very broad, but I tried to narrow the focus on governance, inequality, and climate action as some of the core systems for which we need to take synergies and trade-offs. So the chapter is concluded with essentially a perspective on the future of sustainable development post-COVID, and how, how moving forward, policymakers, practitioners, and wider stakeholders have to adapt to new realities in response to the pandemic, and to switch the dial on development planning and when we negotiate the various intergovernmental processes. Along the following lines, looking at the mega trends, the demographics and rapid technological advancements, and Hana's chapter, delves into that quite well. Harnessing the demographic dividend, we're at the point where the world has its largest youth population. So it's about investing in human capital to bridge what I have described in the chapter as an inequality dilemma, of gender and digital divides, several levels of inequality. From a risk perspective, we have to change our development planning to be more risk informed, more risk resilient. And we're talking not only at the broader normative level, but even at our household and institutional levels, because that is what requires a kind of response from COVID-19. And climate resilient and green recovery. And for me, I find that the Sendai framework is really now more relevant than ever before, and it's more important, not only for small island developing states, but you're seeing its application across all countries in both the global north and south. And importantly, for the Vienna School, strengthening the science policy interface to forecast and to prepare for new challenges. We're seeing how we can utilize new forms of data. It presents opportunities to collect data that we were not collecting before, and how that can inform our development planning moving forward. And finally, just to add on health diplomacy, how we can articulate now future scenarios, build our collective understanding, and just to adjust to the ever-changing dynamics for which we have to respond with COVID-19 and beyond. So that's essentially, in a snapshot, the focus of the chapter on sustainable development.
Great, Tony.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. And then our next speaker is Jonathan Vieira. Jonathan, please.
Thank you, Dr. Brix and Professor Compros, for this invitation. For me, it's a privilege to be part of this discussion. As for people, the pandemic has been a terrible disaster that affected the global economy, the economic diplomacy, and the financing for development track in the UN, as there are persistences, symptoms, prescriptions, side effects, and other analogies in the economy that I addressed in my chapter. One of the main conclusions in the chapter is related with the prescriptions made by the economic diplomacy and in the UN. In general, there is already a consensus of prescribing the economic measures to be taken to rescue countries from an economic crisis. So one of the recommendations is that the debate now should be focused on its implementation. For example, during the crisis of 2008, member states decided to organize the UN Conference on the World Financial Economic Crisis and its impacts. As a result of that conference, member states committed themselves to collaborate and provide a global coordinated response to the crisis, and agreed and adopt measures that could be applied today in 2021. Another area or another conclusion is related with the pre-existences. Before COVID-19, and although the roadmaps, the global economy in the context of financing for development was sick with severe symptoms problems, which caused a great infection in the global economy. 2015 was an historic year for the multilateralism and its roadmaps. Agenda 2030 and the Addis Ababa Action Agenda were adopted in that year. And then we could see that the FFD track plays an essential supporting role on how to finance global development. Up to 2019, the global economy had shown some stability without significant progress in the financing for development arena and in its roadmaps. And it was evaluated in the 2019 high-level dialogue financing for development that showed the same systematic vulnerabilities: debt levels, financial volatility, fiscal space, illicit financial flows, and world trade. All these areas are addressed in the chapter, but I focused my analysis in three areas: international trade, debt, and decent work. Statistics shows that international trade landscape was marked by individual national trade measures that already weakened. WTO was not in position to offer the multilateral tantra that global solutions to global problems. This was the progressive, or this was the result of the progressive accumulation of the trade barriers since 2018, mainly between US and China, and in effect to dominated in high interconnected global value chains. Regarding with debt, for example, the situation was and is critical. For many developing countries, the pandemic represents a perfect storm, encapsulating and deteriorating the long-standing fiscal situation and additional needs for spending and collapsed incomes. Regarding with the future of work, my chapter is focused also in the gender perspective. The COVID-19, for example, followed are having a regressive effect in the gender equality. Women's jobs are 1.0 times more vulnerable to the crisis than men's. In fact, women make up 39% of global employment and is the 54% of the total job losses. The book has present actions and recommendations, but the most important is that the economic and financial situations are heterogeneous, and I requiring a tailor-made solution that consider countries' diverse vulnerabilities. But there is one medicine that may be administered generally, leadership and political decision. For example, for fiscal therapy in developing countries, it's imperative that the debt service moratorium. This approach has been taken by part of the COVID-19 response strategy, but G20, World Bank, IMF, and others. That is the kind of lessons that we need to learn. In the future of work, for example, the environmental and climate action may provide new jobs opportunities when moving towards a green economy. Although green economies can cause significant job losses in carbon intensity industries in accordance to the ILO, this will be offset by the creation of 24 million new jobs worldwide by 2030. All these elements are addressed in the chapter, and I hope that it could contribute to the debates in the academic and also in the multilateral arena. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your talk, Jonathan. And then the next speaker on my list is Andres Fiallo. Andres, please.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, good evening, and good morning to everyone in Vienna, in New York, and all over the world. In addition to thanking all my colleagues for participating today, I'll provide some elements contained in the book with regard to peace and security. In chapter 5 on peace and security, we depart from the notion of, as in every other chapter, from the notion of COVID-19 as a force multiplier for all aspects of diplomacy. Our lens are the lens of sustaining peace, where there's no development without peace, no peace without development. And also on the sense that peace is not only the absence of disturbance and the absence of war, but the presence of justice, freedom, and well-being. I will not have the time to mention all the elements contained on peace and security, but I will be very glad to mention 3 very central elements. First, the Spanish flu. Second, the UN was ready, we weren't. Third and last, what we need to be future ready. So on the Spanish flu, we traveled back to 1918 to consider the impact of the Spanish flu and to unpack the relation between pandemics and peace and security. The conclusion is simple. Pandemic and existing insecurities reinforce each other. The future after the Spanish flu, we know already, it was hunger, poverty, exacerbated violence, and 20 years later, it was actually also another world war. This is something that we want to avoid in the future of COVID-19. The second point, the UN was ready, we weren't. Okay, so the COVID-19, I think one of my colleagues already mentioned, happened in a context of criticism against multilateralism and race of nationalism. But it's very important that we all are conscious and know that 17 years ago, the UN was already addressing the global vulnerability to new infectious disease. The 2000 report of the high-level panel on threat, challenge, and change, created by Kofi Annan in 2003, already addressed the potential international security threats posed by the natural outbreak of an infectious disease. It actually also suggested the need for strong coordination between the Director General of the WHO and the Security Council on how to address at the moment of the rise of a pandemic. And it also, in its conclusion, suggested that the deterioration of the global health system needed to be addressed. This is 17 years ago. The UN was calling for efforts to have more robust public health systems, and obviously 17 years later, we know we did not do enough in terms of international community and member states. With regard to the recommendations on the Security Council and the WHO, I want to mention that in this case, when COVID-19 outbreak, the Security Council took 4 months before adopting Resolution 2532, joining the other organs of the UN system in the combat against COVID-19. My third point was, what do we need to be future ready? We need, in general, adaptability and implementation, but we need regular review of non-military international peace and security threats. This is a recommendation from one of our main contributors, Sarah Cliff. We need a strengthened preventive diplomacy. This is the main effort led by Secretary General Antonio Guterres. He's switching the focus of the UN approach on peace and security towards preventive diplomacy. We need a more equitable world order with human being at the center. We need to strengthen multilateralism. We need to feed multilateralism, provide multilateralism with tools and with content, and making it more substantive and effective. We need to build a more resilient United Nations and a more flexible method of works, including by a greater use of digital technology. We as people need to put pressure in our governments in a democratic way, through democratic means, in order to halt expenditures in arms, in particular nuclear weapons, when it's the case. When this is especially when you consider that 1 year of expenditures by 9 countries on nuclear weapons can easily budget and fund 30 years of operation of the WHO. Last year, it was not only the 75th anniversary of the United Nations, but it was also the 75th commemoration of the nuclear bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. I think in the book with the peace and security, we are trying to provide some elements to contribute to the discussions, and hopefully some elements also to contribute to the solutions. And I thank you very much for your attention.
Andres, thank you very much. And then we'll come to our last speaker, and that is Hana Al-Hashimi. Mona, you have the word.
Thank you, Professor. I want to thank you and Dr. Brix, as well as the Vienna Diplomatic Academy, for inviting us to discuss the book. And we hope that our insights and our recommendations are of value to your students and to your affiliated diplomats and other scholars. I wanted to thank my co-authors, first and foremost, for inviting me to join them in writing the concluding chapter, where I had the opportunity to highlight each of their conclusions and how they've contributed, each in their own way in their respective field, to the vision of the UN 75 Declaration. In my own chapter, I focus on human rights and the rule of law, and take into account the erosion of both of those highly guarded principles of the UN Charter, and find that the declaration, as a result of the pandemic, can serve as a turning point away from that erosion and to a recommitment to the UN Charter and to the Declaration of Human Rights. Ultimately, I believe that that restoration can bring us to greater credibility and effectiveness of the UN, not as a matter of ideals, but as a matter of self-preservation. Our climate change challenge, our pandemic challenge, our socioeconomic challenges, and the reprehensible wars, genocides, and successive terrorist attacks have to stop. And the only way to do that is to ensure that those who are entrusted with guarding the system are themselves accountable to the system and respect the values and the principles and the fundamental elements of our charter, the same way that they call upon others to do. If they themselves don't respect it, they become less effective themselves in asking others to do so. So the founding fathers emerged from World War II and adopted the UN Charter to offer a way out of war and genocide and towards peace and security, socioeconomic advancement, what we call today sustainable development, self-determination of all peoples, and human rights for all. As I said, nobody would mistake Franklin Delano Roosevelt or Winston Churchill or Stalin or Chiang Kai-shek as being idealists or optimists. These were hard-won lessons of a very, very bloody war and a very, very savage Holocaust that led to the principles that we hold dear in the UN Charter. So it's not a question of idealism or optimism, but rather a question of commitment to the salvation of humankind and to the salvation of our planet. So similarly, in the declaration commemorating the 75th anniversary of the UN, today's leaders came together in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic and promised to build back a better post-pandemic world, not just to end the pandemic, but also to address its socioeconomic impacts, not just to restore the health of their populations, but also the health of our beloved planet, not just to restore the status quo ante, but to do better in living up to the promise of the UN Charter and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, to end discrimination, to prevent genocide and war, to combat terrorism in all its forms, and to ensure justice and accountability where violations occur. We were really off to a bad start in the 21st century, beginning with the 9/11 attacks, then followed by the US-UK invasion of Iraq, soon after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, chemical weapons in Syria, successive genocides in Darfur, Myanmar, and other places, and the savagery of ISIS. This was not a good start. And in that light of that background, in March 2020, we learned that it is imperative that the UN principal organs be able to convene and to act, regardless of the nature of the crisis, not only to deliberate, but to take decisions and to adopt resolutions as they did after 9/11 and Hurricane Sandy in New York, and now throughout the pandemic. As my colleague Andres mentioned, it took the Security Council 4 months to adopt their first resolution responding to the pandemic. The fissures in the Council, in particular among the P5, paralyzed its ability to take prompt and effective action. The UNGA acted faster and far more coherently, both in adopting several COVID-related resolutions, but ultimately also in adopting a UN 75 declaration that met the moment. In a rare show of proactive leadership, both on peacekeeping and in calling for a global ceasefire, SG Guterres also came forward with an initiative and exercised his prerogative to bring matters to the attention of the Security Council and to make concrete recommendations, albeit doing so without mentioning specifically his power to do so under Article 99. And with the help of the E10, in due course, got his initiative adopted. When he led, member states followed. In light of the lessons learned, we need more of this activity by the General Assembly and the Secretary General when the Security Council is flailing or failing. We need to bridge the digital divide to ensure inclusivity and equal participation of large and small nations, as well as other stakeholders, not only member states and states parties to conflicts, but victims and non-states parties to conflicts on the UNSC agenda as well. To the extent that the declaration recognized the need for the reform of the UN principal organs, and in light of the lessons learned, my chapter also includes several recommendations to mobilize the Council to be more inclusive in its deliberations and more prompt and effective in fulfilling its responsibility. Regarding the veto, which has often paralyzed the ability of the Council to fulfill its responsibility, I turn to the General Assembly and call for the revitalization of the emergency special session powers under the Uniting for Peace resolution. And last but not least, call upon the Secretary General to be more proactive, as he has been recently, and exercise his prerogatives under Article 99. If member states truly commit to the undertaking in the 75 Declaration and live up to the promise of the Charter and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, not only in word, but also in deed and in their action, the wake-up call provided by the pandemic can serve as a turning point away from the erosion of the rule of international law we saw at the start of the 21st century. We have an opportunity to resurrect the Security Council's responsibility to revitalize the authority of the General Assembly, and to restore the independence of the Secretariat as the UN's sixth principal organ. This would go a long way in restoring the credibility and effectiveness of the UN in the post-COVID world. Dag Hammarskjöld said, the former Secretary General, that the UN was not created to take mankind to heaven, but to save humanity from hell. It is up to us to make those words ring true.
Una, thank you very much. That was quite a vision, actually, and most of which I share wholeheartedly, I have to say. We're going to move now to our questions and answers session. And we have from the audience thus far one question, and I encourage the audience to ask many more. In the meantime, let me just abuse my powers as a chair and ask a few questions to you. And also going in the order in which you presented. Hana, you are a member of the Internet Governance for a Multistakeholder Advisory Group. It's a long word, but it's about Internet governance. So I'd be interested, what can Internet governance contribute to all of that? Is that a new mode of multilateralism, perhaps lurking somewhere there, that provides new opportunities? And I'm just going to go on with my questions, okay? And then afterwards, you all have the opportunity to answer. Vad, I'd be interested in basically the balance between national interests on the one hand and taking care of the international system on the other. So something like realpolitik on the one hand and something like raison de système on the other. So after COVID, do we find more of a global outlook in New York, or would you say in perhaps at times also in domestic politics? Or do you think it's actually the reverse? So there's the belief that there are actually no such thing as really global problems, or there may be global problems, but there can still be national solutions to that. Tony, Shay, I have this. I really like your talk about the Sustainable Development Goals and everything, and the trouble that goes with it. It's a bit of a tricky question for you that I always ask myself. When we looked at the Millennium Development Goals, which are obviously less comprehensive, but still, then there were often controversies about who funds what, and then there was global financial crisis, economic crisis, and everything. And so then there was oftentimes an use as an excuse. Okay, so this is why progress has been achieved thus far, but not further. And we all know, so in terms of the most vulnerable segments of society, there's a lot a lot remains to be done. Now, with the Sustainable Development Goals, should COVID be actually, could that be a similar problem? So could that be the problem that, okay, going back, it echoes a little bit my question to Vard beforehand. Could it be that, so that there are these quite narrowly defined national interests, and that one forgets once more that the world is actually interconnected, and we really have to solve these problems. Jonathan, question to you. So you talked about economics, talked about trade, and what do you think the local governments can do to address the kind of questions that you pointed to? So, because we have quite a good grasp, I think, about the international one, but perhaps also what could happen on a local level. Andres, a bit of a philosophical question to you. It has something to do that you basically talk about one of my research projects. But it seems to me that phrasing. So on the one hand, I'm all for a broad definition of peace. Yeah. So as you started your talk out with. So in terms of justice, in terms of well-being would also be then obviously the bridge to health. On the other hand, I'm sometimes a bit scared that if we broaden the term of peace and also the term of security, actually, that a lot of things that ought to be treated, say, by the World Health Organization, they may actually end up at the Security Council. So I was wondering what you say about that. To some extent, it perhaps ties in a little bit what Mona said as well. So with her plea to look a little more at the General Assembly as opposed to the Security Council. And then yeah, Mona finally. So there's a lot in your talk about the possibilities that we can actually learn as a world community. We can learn from COVID, and learning is a term that you've used. And theories of international relations and also political psychology sometimes refer to that as a cognitive punch. So something really horrible happens, and then we really come to our senses, and we're really gonna do things differently. My question to you is, because you outlined quite a far-reaching agenda of change, do you think that this cognitive punch of COVID is enough? And to some extent, it's a little bit, again, reformulating my question, whether the punch is actually going to redirect us, or is going to redirect the leaders that we want to address more towards the seemingly easy national and domestic solutions. Seemingly because, well, there won't be solutions, can't be because they're global problems, or on the other hand, whether we have a chance for a more global outlook. So much about my questions thus far. I'm going to read one question we got from the audience as well, and I'm just gonna read it out. Would we see the same number of business and official travels post-COVID? So whoever wants to take that question is feel free to do so. And perhaps you can go again in the order in which you presented. So Hana, you would be first.
With pleasure, Professor. Thank you very much for the insightful question. So I'll take the question first on the role of internet governance over the last year. And really, the governance question speaks to the heart of really the ability of multilateralism and the international system to respond to rapidly changing technologies and global realities. Of course, as we know, COVID-19 disrupted and you know, the ability of technology altered really the way in which we learn, we live our lives, and we earn our livelihoods, so we do our work. But the governance question speaks to our ability to cooperate across borders on how the internet in and of itself is in a way regulated at the most extreme, perhaps, interpretation of the word. And we've seen some practices over years, including the development of the global data protection regulation in 2016, as well as a more nuanced interpretation of networked governance and how you collaborate across sectors and systems, such as through dynamic coalitions in the Internet Governance Forum, which some of you may be familiar of. In the last year, we saw this big movement driven in large part by the United Nations Secretary General through the adoption of a roadmap towards digital cooperation. And what we saw in this process is that the world really is aligned on the need for effective global cooperation that is both transparent and agile, and that enables us to maximize the potential of technologies as force multipliers for good across all walks of life and across all industries. So there's absolutely alignment that it's not acceptable anymore for half of the world to be offline. And we've seen considerable efforts in the last year such that infrastructure for technologies has actually been accelerated in their rollout, such that what might have taken 3 months was done within 3 weeks at the start of the pandemic, to be able to allow businesses to continue, education to continue, and sectors to continue. I think another interesting point is on digital technologies, actually touching to the point of how you have on the social contract between governments and people, as well as organizations, and how maybe digital technologies might provide a means for authentic, engaging, and purposeful communication. So you can see the use of technologies such as big data to enhance actually our understanding of priorities of people, if it's used widely enough, and to be able to be more responsive. But really, when looking to the future, I think that human element remains essential. And if technology is changing the relationship between governments and citizens, it's on us to make sure that that's a positive and empowering change. So thank you.
Thank you very much. And then Vaat, you want to answer as well?
Regarding the national priorities and how government approached the pandemic, I was quoting this paper compiled by the Advanced School of Government of Oxford University. It provides very useful resources on how governments address the pandemics, such as ban of public gatherings, restrictions of travels, closures of offices, investment. But something that is common doesn't have to take place simultaneously. It also happened that the spread of the pandemic happened in different times. So how governments react to this pandemic can be like a wave. So right now, for example, where I'm now in the US, the pandemic has been the government policy is not anymore requiring people to wear masks, for example, for certain categories. But in other country, the government is trying to get as much as possible the access to emergency equipments. So it depends on at which stage the country is dealing at the time. But when the book was written last year, COVID vaccine was not yet developed. So the effort at that time in the global cooperation was more on the joint effort to discover the vaccines. But right now, after we see there are several producers that produce these vaccines, so the efforts is now on ensuring the global access to these various vaccines through, for example, COVAX facilities, and also through other bilateral cooperation between governments, between private sector and government. So basically, the common understanding is that everybody needs to take care of each other because the pandemic can spread regardless of the national border. And something that I also noticed is that we are more and we tend to scientific-based decision making in the sense that when the pandemic started, we saw there are a lot of informations out there, but there are also a lot of problem with infodemics, they call it. So we want to make sure that the governments or all the policymakers, when they are making decisions, it's well informed by those who are expert in their field. Because you know that experts can give opinion, but giving opinion will not make us an expert. So this is what we are seeing right now in many countries. And regarding the point on the global, I just want to give a quick answer about how the UN operates during the pandemic peak here in New York, especially between March and September, because we could not have in-person meetings. It was a surreal moment to be a diplomat here because nobody was there in the UN. And what essentially was done by the General Assembly was it managed to modify its decision-making process through a mechanism which was adopted by a resolution 74/544. It's entitled Procedure for Taking Decisions of the General Assembly during the Coronavirus Disease 2019. So what does it mean? Essentially, this method functioned through the president of the GA proposing a draft of decision of the UN to all UN member states and give them 3 days to respond to this decision draft. If there is no objection, then this can be adopted. But if there is one country that objects to it, it's like a veto, but it's all countries have veto. So you can imagine how difficult it is to create a decision for the UN, even before the pandemic, when we were still able to meet in person. To have a consensus is not easy but now we are doubled with the impossibility to have in-person meetings. But nevertheless, more than 70 decisions were made under this procedure from, as I said, from March to July, and some of them are related with how to deal with COVID-19. The detail of this resolution can be found in the book. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Tony Shay, you're the next one on the list, I think.
Thank you, Professor, for that very interesting question. We have to start on the premise that, you know, the genesis of the MDGs is totally different from that of the SDGs. Moving from a top-down approach to development planning to one that was more intergovernmental in its approach and had consensual, essentially, you know, ownership among all member states. And that, I think, makes the difference in terms of how we look at national interest and interconnectivity. And being here in New York, you get a really good sense from delegates that there is an appreciation for the indivisibility and the interconnected nature of the SDGs. And the COVID-19 pandemic itself was, as I said, it was the true test of the 2030 agenda, because this is an issue that is essentially health related, has its genesis in climate and biodiversity, but then it is having these vast social and economic impacts and implications that will go beyond, you know, even the next generation. So how I see it is that it puts us as member states in a situation where we have to do a bit more systems thinking, and it's calling on us to act more collaboratively and in partnerships. And we have seen that, and this is, you know, it's showcasing this platform for multilateral action, which my colleague Andres spoke to. This is where countries are now working in solidarity, because it recognizes that the failure or the success of any one country depends on the other. So this is probably one of the positives that has you know, emerged from the COVID-19 pandemic, and how we actually see the 2030 agenda in action, recognizing the indivisibility and the interconnected nature across all goals and just across all the three pillars of the United Nations.
Very, very good news. Yes. Then I think, yeah, Jonathan, you're next on the list.
Thank you very much. I think that local governments have played a very critical role in the pandemic for its policies on the confinement and the pressure in the health systems, for example. In fact, more than 95% of the COVID contagions came from the urban areas. And in this sense, COVID exacerbated the inequalities within and between cities in the world. For that reason, it's very important that for local governments recovery, financial support mechanism will be essential through access to credits in national and development banks. I think that we have a good roadmap in this regard, which is the New Urban Agenda, but I think that, again, it's important the implementation and the political decision. And at the same time, it's necessary to rethink the cities and promote the diversification of their economies in sustainable way. This conversation probably should take years, but as in other pandemics, its end will mark the beginning of a new socioeconomic stage at all levels. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you. And then Andres, you're next.
Thank you very much for a very interesting question. And I do invite you really to read our book, and a lot of the answer will be contained already, is already contained in the book, but I want to mention pretty quickly that I will agree that we do not need to securitize development. So when I presented my chapter, I'm not proposing the securitizing of development, but at the same time, it's very important that we focus on the root causes of conflict. So it's true that there are conflict caused artificially because of the selling and business of arms, but many other conflicts are coming from very different reasons, including the exacerbation of poverty, social fabrics, the vulnerability in front of violent extremism. 1 out of 4 young person living in a zone of conflict or in a fragile zone. So that's one very important point. In addition to that, we are having a pandemic that its genesis might come from the abuse and overexploitation of nature. So it's important that we address together in a comprehensive way, for example, also climate and security. With regard to the institutional work of the UN, the General Assembly, I agree with you, is the main role and authority of the General Assembly. We are 193 member states there, and we also address all these elements. But the Security Council has the capacity to not only provide recommendations, but also to provide to take decisions, to facilitate human accesses, to fight the context of food insecurity, for example. But yes, I invite you to read our book, and I really thank you for the opportunity.
Andres, I'll definitely read the book, and I'm looking forward to it. And Mona.
Yes, I will try to be brief so that we have time for Q&A from the participants. Indeed, moments of crisis can be moments of opportunity, and the UN member states have, at least in word, seized this opportunity to recommit to the promise of the Charter and the Declaration on Human Rights in the 75 Declaration. So now it's time to put those words to action. In order to survive as a human race and to save our planets, we have to stand together. And the good news is we already have the way forward. We have it in the Charter. We have it in the Decade of Action. We have it in the 2030 Agenda. We have it in the Resolution 1325 on Women, Peace and Security. We have the tools. We have the policies. We know what the right ideas are. Where we have failed is in implementing those ideas. So if indeed member states come together as they have vowed to do, and take seriously these commitments and fulfill the promises and fulfill the vision that they themselves have carved out, we're not that far from saving ourselves and saving our planet. The difference has to come with whether we adhere to the power of principles or to the principles of power. And so far, we have been guided by the principles of power. We have also to choose our common humanity over our narrowly defined national interests. We've done this before and had great periods of relative calm, but not sustainable peace. And that missing element of the sustainable peace is the question of justice and the rule of law. On the question of the pandemic, I think it's very easy to visualize the right path forward. The Council should take the reins and lead a global response that relies on the WHO's recommendations instead of fighting about the nomenclature. The General Assembly should adopt the universal basic income and make sure that no one is left behind as a result of the socioeconomic savagery we've witnessed as a result of the pandemic. And the SG should hold a pledging conference to ensure that every nation has access to the vaccine at affordable and possibly free prices, and that nations administer this vaccine without discrimination on gender, race, ethnic, or sexual orientation grounds. What a wonderful world that would be. Again, this would not be an ideal, this would be self-preservation. The sooner we end the pandemic and end the possibility of further variants, the better off we all are.
Yes, it's basically a plea to see the enlightened self-interest, right? So the long-term self-interest.
Yes.
I have no external questions, unfortunately. So we can debate a little bit amongst us as a group, and please obviously also feel free to ask questions amongst each other. One thing I'd be interested in is, because we are talking about COVID, and if we just now focus on global health, how do you expect things to unfold there? Because so we've had we're experiencing this massive pandemic, and it strikes me as I'm surprised actually that we don't see more debates, and that would be that in Geneva about how to strengthen the global health order further, because if we compare that to the SARS outbreaks, SARS-CoV-1 in the early zeros, that sparked the revision of the international health regulations. And the only halfway tangible initiative that I could discover now about some new legal instrument is this idea of a pandemic treaty. Other issues that to me probably would sound very straightforward is just to look at the international health regulations again properly, and perhaps no longer exempt the Director General's recommendations as being non-binding, right? So that's Article 1 that basically weakens the recommendations very, very severely. But I was thinking about what your opinions about this are. So so basically in a post-COVID diplomatic world, is that going to be a world that's going to make sure that we can prevent the next pandemic, or is that a world where the next pandemic may simply be a few years or perhaps a decade away? Mona, yeah.
Actually, I think it's an opportunity to say something that ends on an optimistic note. I mean, the last pandemic, 100 years ago, we lost 50 million people in the pandemic. In this pandemic, we're approximately at 3 million, which is 3 million too many. I do not mean to be dismissive or to reduce the magnitude of the tragedy, but that is the amount of progress that we have made as a human civilization in those 100 years. And as we learn these lessons, and it's incumbent upon us to learn those lessons, I think it is important that we do even better the next pandemic, which will be inevitable. But it's also climate change that will give us these crises. It's also the wars and the continuing genocides that give us these conflicts. So we have seen the error of our ways. We have been given a very clear wake-up call. We have seen what can be done when we come together based on universally accepted principles, based on a common strategy to achieve a common goal that is to the mutual benefit of all. Whether it's binding or non-binding, the key is not whether it's soft guidance or hard law. If we can get cooperation, if we can get commitment, if we can get a self-interested recognition that our survival as a human race is at stake, and that fiddle paddling with nomenclature is only going to hurt, not help, including those very states that are putting up those yellow lights, not red lights, then I think we can rely on soft guidance if universally accepted and mutually agreed and universally committed out of self-interest. I think we can make a difference. This does not preclude a broader effort to have a codified law, but we should focus on voluntary commitment in self-interest towards mutually agreed way forward.
Mona, thank you very much. Is there anyone else who wants to add something? Because otherwise, it is past. So in terms of timing, we have been absolutely perfect. I would like to thank you very, very much for great presentations, for sparked a lot of ideas in my mind for my research as well. And I think it were very, very important themes that we have covered, from health to economics, development, peace and security, and so on. And I'd like to thank you very, very much. And to the audience, If you want to know more about the book, well, then maybe buy it, have a look at it. I'll definitely do that as well. And I'm looking forward to a great read. So then let me wish you a nice evening, or if you watch from further away, perhaps a nice rest of the day. And yeah, and all the best to you. Thank you.